You think you know deserts, endless dunes that swallow footsteps, hard sun bleaching history to pale bone. You picture caravans and sand, hieroglyphs in museums, and neat rows of limestone blocks catalogued by scholars wearing dust-smeared hats. But imagine, for a moment, a place where the maps refuse to settle, where the usual tidy narratives of kings and tombs unravel into something stranger, a place the locals call Desert Storm, where storms of sand don't simply erase the past, they seem to hide something the desert itself is trying very hard not to let you see. I want to start there, with that dissonance between what we expect and what actually waits in the heat, a modern military codename, a half-buried mound with stone unlike anything catalogued, and an oral memory that refuses to be silenced. This film, and yes, you and I are making it together, is an invitation to walk the ridges, to trace the lines of old trade routes, to listen for the thin, persistent echo of a secret that insists upon being found. I promise you revelations that will unsettle what you think you know about ancient empires, and I promise unanswered questions that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. We will not pretend every riddle has a tidy solution. Instead, we will gather evidence, weigh competing ideas, and keep our eyes open for the improbable, the mythic, the downright uncanny. We begin with a single stubborn fact. At Desert Storm, researchers found a stone box, not in a tomb but cut into the desert bed. It seems too precise for the casual weathering of millennia. Around it, pottery shards echo styles tied to the late Old Kingdom, roughly 4,200 years ago, yet some of the inscriptions are written in a hands-on style that looks older and yet contains symbols that simply do not match any catalogued script. Now, let's be fair, deserts are littered with anomalies that dissolve under closer scrutiny, and scientific method demands patience and skepticism. But here's where it gets tricky. Every time an excavation team thought they'd written the last chapter, another layer opened, a wooden plank treated with a resin not known in the region, a string of glass beads whose chemical signature points to far-off beaches, a burial posture more commonly associated with coastal peoples than desert nomads. Still, for all the evidence, the local stories refused to be reduced to mere superstition. Elder villagers spoke of giant watchers in the dunes, of a ship made of black stone that visited on nights when the stars rearranged themselves. Mythic language, yes, but myths often encode memory in a form designed to survive when literal details fade. So we keep digging, and we keep asking the hard questions. What was moving across this landscape 4 millennia ago? Who planted that box where no tomb should be? Why do the stones hum, at least according to the technicians who swear their magnetometers behave oddly around them? Keep your skepticism close, and your wonder closer, because some secrets only reveal themselves to those who can do both at once. Now picture yourself with me, the horizon a wavering sheet of heat, wind scratching your ears with grit. You step off a rocky crest and the world tilts into silence. Even the sand seems to listen. A line of stones, half swallowed, marks a corridor that might be a road or the edge of an erased harbor. Imagine the first archaeologist here, notebook clenched in sunburned fingers, an assistant pointing to a depression that looks almost like a keel cut into bedrock. In the chest beneath that bedrock, the box, shaped as if by measured hands, waited for the air to touch it again. This is not the tidy tomb filled with gold we hoped for. Instead, it is a technical problem, an invitation to think differently about trade, movement, and cultural exchange. We will walk this trail, but we will not romanticize it. Our aim is to bring you evidence rendered with the precision of science, and narrated with the imagining that allows us to feel the tiny shocks of mystery that keep history alive. Take a breath now, this is only the beginning. Over the next hour, though an hour is a childhood's blink against the weight of time, we'll move from the hard, crumbling walls of Desert Storm to lost oases, drowned settlements, and megalithic stones that seem to know the tides. 6 to 8 segments will lay out discrete episodes of puzzlement, artifacts that do not belong where they were found, skeletons that ask more questions than they answer, inscriptions that mock our alphabets, trade networks that suggest voyages older than we accepted, engineering feats that push the limits of what we credit to an ancient workforce. Each segment is a standalone mystery, but together they form a mosaic, a pattern with edges that refuse to close. You will hear about trade routes that cross deserts like veins, carrying not just goods but ideas and perhaps strangers, about a canyon that holds a sound no one can explain, about a throne room submerged beneath silt where carvings show visitors with faces that do not match any known population. We will meet skeptical geologists, cautious conservators, and storytellers who insist that the sand remembers. We will also wrestle with how modern politics and modern greed shape which mysteries get excavated and which are left to sleep. But this is not archaeology as a dry cataloging of bits. This is archaeology as detective story and as him. When science meets story, the room fills with possibilities. My role here is to stand at the junction of both, to be your translator, your guide, and the voice that asks the question out loud when the evidence is stubbornly ambiguous. So stay with me. Bring your skepticism. Bring your curiosity. And when we arrive at a place where data and myth clasp hands, don't be surprised if you find yourself thinking, as I do, that we have only begun to learn the true shape of human ambition and dread. The first of our segments begins with a simple, almost throwaway line: the stone ship of Desert Storm, a submerged, keel-shaped structure carved into bedrock and buried under 4 meters of windblown sand. In one sentence that names the site and hints at its mystery, we are already asking you to abandon comfortable certainties. The stone ship looks like a boat, but it sits where there is no water now. Historically, the region around Desert Storm sits at the crossroads of Saharan trade and Nile hinterland influence around 2200 to 2000 BCE, a time of political upheaval in Egypt and of new maritime contacts in the Mediterranean. Archaeologists date the ship carving by associated pottery and carbon samples from nearby hearths to about 4,100 years ago, a period scholars call the Late Old Kingdom collapse, an era when climate shifts and political fragmentation force communities to adapt in unexpected ways. Measurements matter here. The keel runs roughly 20 meters in length, the angle of the prow suggests a design intended to cut through waves, and the grooves carved along the hull are too evenly spaced to be a coincidence. They look like mortise and tenon joints for planks. This is engineering at scale. Key discoveries near the stone ship included fragments of cedar wood treated with a pitch that chemical analysis ties to a resin profile used by Eastern Mediterranean shipbuilders, a cache of shells from a distant coastline, and an amulet stamped with a motif normally associated with Nile Delta cults. Now, here's where it gets tricky. One school of thought insists the stone ship was a ritual object, a symbolic vessel carved for waterless funerary rites, an earthbound ark meant to carry souls. Proponents point to the funerary goods found nearby, the orientation toward the rising of a particular star, and local funerary texts that describe voyages to a watery afterlife. Another theory holds that it marks a now-vanished shoreline, an ancient lagoon or seasonal sea that slipped away as climates shifted. The ship would then be literal evidence of lost coasts and seafaring communities. A third, more radical hypothesis suggests that the ship is evidence of contact between Saharan groups and seafaring peoples far earlier than the established records allow, implying a network of coastal trade that reached into the interior desert through overland conduits. Supporters of this idea point to the cedar and certain glassy beads whose isotopes match Atlantic or even Iberian sources. Still, for all the carbon dates, the chemical signatures, and the careful stratigraphy, doubts remain. How did seafaring technology reach this inland site if the coastline was then hundreds of kilometers away? Could ceremonial mimicry explain the ship's precision, or is it a fossil of a drowned world? There is also a mythic layer that refuses to be ignored. Elders tell of a black hull that would appear when the sandstorms shifted and the stars arranged like a net. In those nights, they say, giant forms, the watchers, as one old man put it, would stand on the crest, tall as a house and carrying lamps that flamed coal blue. Whether this is a poetic memory of huge statues, a distorted account of visiting traders, or an encoded warning about an ancient catastrophe, the image persists in oral memory. Picture yourself walking that foggy trail at dawn, sand clinging to your boots, the empty horizon folding like an ocean. Imagine hearing the scrape of stone where the keel lies, and feeling, for a moment, less like a spectator and more like a participant in a ritual that spans ages. The stone ship asks us to imagine vast distances bridged by human determination. or to imagine an imagined vessel that helped a people name their losses. Either way, the scene tugs at a deeper human urge to map the unknown by building things that look like what we lacked. Still, for all the evidence and speculation, we are left with the hum of uncertainty. There are radiocarbon results that suggest the cedar planking was heat-treated in a way not common in local traditions. There are beads that traveled far. There are ritual objects that point inward toward mortuary practices. Yet the mortise antennae-like grooves cry out for a marine explanation. Now, let's be fair. Erosion can mimic joints, and ceremonial architecture can mimic practical design. But if this was a real hull moved inland by a vanished sea, it rewrites a map of ancient coastlines and pushes the timeline of seafaring exchange across continents. We still don't know whether the stone ship is an honest relic of a drowned port, a monumental metaphor, or the leftover of a long-distance contact that refused to be contained by current historical models. The evidence sits quietly in the sand, patient and implacable, refusing to be rushed into our narratives. As night falls over Desert Storm and the wind hums like a distant choir, the questions multiply. If the stone ship marks lost water, what else went with it? What populations moved, adapted, or vanished when coasts retracted? If the carving is ritual, why such astonishing craftsmanship for a monument meant only to be seen by the dead? And if it is evidence of long-distance voyaging into the desert interior, how do we reconcile the logistics, the food, the fresh water, the infrastructure required to move cedar boards hundreds of kilometers inland? Each hypothesis is a doorway into a different historical reality, and none of them can yet be closed. Imagine now that you are kneeling beside the keel, tracing one of those grooves with a gloved finger, and feeling the faint vibration the technicians insist they can detect when their instruments pass over it, a low electromagnetic whisper that defies simple explanation. Myth, method, and magnetometer readings, put them together, and you get a story that refuses to settle into either science or legend alone. We still don't know, and that is exactly why we must continue to listen to the sand, to test and retest, and to keep our imaginations honest. When you walk away from the stone ship, you carry with you an uneasy gift, a vision of human beings who were perhaps more connected across the ancient world than we've been willing to admit, or a people who made symbolic vessels to hold grief and memory when the water left their lives. Either version deepens our sense of who we are, inventive, mournful, and stubbornly creative in the face of loss. That, perhaps, is the real discovery here. Whether the ship is literal or figurative, it is a testament to human adaptability, and to the lengths we'll go to anchor ourselves when the familiar world dissolves. Keep that in your pocket as we move on to other mysteries, because every fragment we pull from the sand will ask the same thing: how do we carry our past forward, and at what cost? We still don't know. The next mystery to pull you deeper into the sand is the one the field teams now call Echo Canyon, a narrow cleft cut into the bedrock like a wound, where the bones of a dozen people were found upright, arranged as if standing in a silent council, and where some of those bones are so large that even the osteologists paused and said the word everyone imagines as myth: giants. In one sentence, the Echo Canyon skeletons, an upright assemblage of burials with anomalously large skeletal remains, clustered in a formation that suggests ritual, and dated to a time when the valley should have been sparsely populated. To give you the scale and the context, Echo Canyon sits in a rain-shadow valley at the edge of what would have been a semi-arid corridor during the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 3,500 to 3,700 years ago, about 1500 to 1700 BC, though recent Bayesian recalibrations of radiocarbon dates have widened the potential window by several centuries in either direction. The canyon itself is narrow, barely 4 meters across in most places, and plunges into a chamber where a shallow aquifer once pooled. The burials occupy a terrace about 2 meters above what was then standing water, suggesting deliberate placement rather than haphazard death. Osteologists measuring femoral shafts, humeri, and pelvic dimensions recorded values that, when scaled to modern human averages, imply statures that would range, conservatively, from 1.95 to well over 2.3 meters, with some long bone fragments disproportionately robust, suggesting not merely tallness but overall massive musculature. Those are not measurements to dismiss lightly. They are the sort of numbers that send people to their libraries and to their skepticism. Alongside those bones were grave goods whose styles cross cultural boundaries: bronze daggers of a design known in the Levant, faience beads of an Egyptian stripe, and ochre-stained textiles with patterns echoing inland steppe motifs. Measurements, again, mattered. The daggers are about 28 to 32 centimeters long, with tangs that suggest they were hafted to handles shaped for strong grips. The faience beads are pierced by drills that left microscopic marks consistent with high-speed rotary tools, and trace element analysis of the beads points to copper sources from southwestern Anatolia. Taken together, the material culture suggests a nexus, a point where ideas and goods converged, rather than an isolated group cut off from exchange. Now, here's where it gets tricky. One straightforward interpretation is that Echo Canyon represents an elite cemetery of a local chiefdom. Tall, well-fed leaders, perhaps a lineage who controlled the aquifer and the trade passing through the valley. Height, after all, can be influenced by diet and social status. Elite diets high in protein correlate with taller average stature. Another theory, embraced by a group of researchers who specialize in ancient trauma and biomechanics, argues that the bones are not merely large through superior nutrition but show hypertrophic markers and muscle attachment sites consistent with repetitive, intense labor or combat. These markers could indicate a warrior class whose lifestyle produced thickened cortical bone. A third, more controversial idea, picked up tone and traction in popular discussions, suggests that these remains could belong to a genetically distinct population, perhaps an offshoot of larger-bodied peoples from a distant region whose migration left only bone and legend in its wake. Proponents of this hypothesis point to mitochondrial haplogroups extracted from well-preserved samples. Some haplogroups match broadly with known Near Eastern sequences, but 2 or 3 of the sequences do not have clean matches in available databases, leaving room for speculation about unrecorded lineages. Still, for all the genetic work, contamination risks, and sample sizes that bedevil ancient DNA studies, we must be cautious. Absence of match in modern databases is not proof of extinct giants. It may simply reflect the gaps in our comparative collections. Beyond bones and genes, there was another puzzle: the arrangement. The skeletons were not laid supine as typical burials, nor were they fully extended in crouched positions seen elsewhere. Instead, many were propped against carved stone stelae, some with arms around one another, in positions that suggest a tableau frozen in time, a council or council-like ritual preserved by rapid burial or some binding practice. In a few instances, metal collars or rings, large enough to fit over a man's neck, were found adjacent to vertebrae, and some had traces of organic fibers that, when analyzed, produced compounds similar to tannins used in bark-based leatherworking. Now, let's be fair, collars can be misinterpreted. They can be grave markers, harness elements, or ceremonial pieces. But if they are collars in the practical sense, we are left to wonder why a community would bury its leaders and binding equipment, and what that says about the social order. One line of thinking sees these collars as symbols of office, like crowns or scepters, worn by elders who govern the water and the roads. Another, darker line imagines ritualized restraint, perhaps a culture that sealed its dead in posture to prevent their spirits from wandering, or even a defeated group whose captives were interred with their bindings intact. We still don't have a clear answer. Layered over the osteological and archaeological data are the local oral traditions, countless small stories that resist a single tidy reading. Villagers 2 kilometers uphill told teams of tall people who kept watch, adding, with a wink or sometimes a tear, that the earth had once swallowed the giants when they grew arrogant. An old storyteller recites a poem, translated and transcribed, in which the first stanza mentions the men who touched the sky and walked with shoulders under the moon, and the following lines turn suddenly to lament about water stolen and a night of thunder when the canyon drank them down. Mythic language, yes, but myths often preserve kernels of event memory. Raids, sudden drownings, or the arrival of an alien people can all be encoded in metaphor. Picture yourself descending into Echo Canyon at dusk with a lantern that throws a narrow cone of light across those upright bones. See the shadow play as the lamp flickers, the stones steely casting long, human-like silhouettes. Feel the skin prickle when a breeze passes through the narrow cleft and the bone taps faintly against rock. This is where human imagination meets hard science, and neither can fully own the story. But here's where it gets trickier still. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel from the skeletons suggests a diet with high levels of marine protein for some individuals, despite the site being hundreds of kilometers from any accessible coastline at the time. The signature is not uniform. Some skeletons show a primarily terrestrial diet with isotopic values consistent with grain and domesticated animals, while others, particularly those with the largest stature, show elevated delta-13C and delta-15N values pointing to significant marine consumption. This uneven dietary pattern raises questions about social stratification and mobility. Were these tall people trading frequently with coastal communities, receiving fish and shell as tribute? Or did they themselves come from coastal regions, migrating inland perhaps in a season of upheaval? The finding dovetails with artifacts like the faience beads and cedar fragments that suggest long-distance connections, but it complicates simple narratives of sedentary farming communities versus nomadic bands. There was also a cache of shell ornaments, tiny mother-of-pearl discs threaded in a particular pattern, found near one skeleton's clavicle, and microwear patterns on the shells indicate they were likely used in tactile rituals, rubbed during ceremonies, perhaps to summon rain or to mark an oath. Now, archaeologists rarely enjoy consensus. Some warn against reading myths and bones into a grand migration story when more parsimonious explanations exist. Differential diet could owe to seasonal fishing journeys, temporary coastal enclaves, or even trade networks that supplied dried fish. Equally, skeletal robustness could be an artifact of sample bias. If the individuals interred here were a selected group of elders or leaders, their remains might not reflect the general population at all. The caution is valid, and we must be careful not to let romance trump method. Still, we can't ignore that multiple lines of evidence point toward unusual mobility and connectivity, and that the human scale here, in bone and in myth, is larger than expected. There is another layer. Tool marks on the stele were made with a chisel type whose microstriations match metal composition more commonly found in the early Bronze Age smithworks of Anatolia, rather than local copper alloys. If that analysis holds under further peer review, which of course it must, it expands the sphere of potential interaction across what we thought were impermeable cultural boundaries. Imagine, if you will, a convoy moving cedar planks and bronze tools along desert paths, stopping at a water source to trade and to bury their elders in a place that marks their presence for generations. Or imagine the more cinematic version, a band of sea raiders who pushed inland during a period of climatic stress, larger-bodied warriors who established control over a life-sustaining aquifer before succumbing to some catastrophe, leaving their bodies propped like sentinels. Local memory then turns them into giants, a cultural shorthand for strength and estrangement. Beyond the bones and artifacts, there is the human element in modern science that shapes what we see. Excavation protocols, funding priorities, and political pressures determine which sites receive attention. Echo Canyon became famous partly because a graduate student insisted on re-excavating a terrace dismissed in an earlier survey, and because a local activist leveraged social media to demand more rigorous investigation. Funding arrived, teams assembled, and the discoveries multiplied. This reveals something important about how mysteries are made in our era, not only by the past, but also by present-day choices about what to unearth and why. The canyon might have remained a footnote if not for those contemporary acts of insistence, and that reminds us that every archaeological narrative is co-authored by the living. Still, for all the bones, isotopes, beads, and community lore, there remains a chill in the unanswered spaces. What exactly happened in that night of thunder the storyteller mentions? Was it a flash flood that surprised the group, trapping those propped in the narrow cleft? Was it warfare, a desperate last stand? Or was it a ritual death, a chosen ending for a leadership class whose last act was to be interred as guardians of the spring? And perhaps the most provocative question of all, did Echo Canyon house individuals who were genetically, phenotypically, and culturally distinct from their neighbors in ways we cannot yet fully resolve? If so, what does that mean about the fluidity of ancient population movements, and about the scale of contact networks in a time often portrayed as localized and parochial. The mythic element is not content to stay in the margins. Some villagers swear the canyon's bones sometimes bleed a red sand when the new moon shines, a poetic report that geologists could attribute to oxidized iron staining, but which a local poet hears as a sign that the earth still remembers violence. Others tell of a hidden cavern deeper than the excavation permits, where a single massive femur lies under a stone that the elders refuse to move. That story has inspired late-night expeditions, minor vandalism, and community debates about treasure versus stewardship. I have stood with elders and heard them whisper that the giants may not have been human in the way we now define it, that their strength came from being half in the old world and half in the sea. Myth again, but myth that frames the encounter in moral and existential terms, the giants as boundary keepers, the canyon as a threshold between known things and unclassifiable others. Picture yourself now in the canyon at dawn, the light skewing at an angle that turns bone to ivory and stone to silver. You run your gloved hand along a femoral fragment and feel the ridging where muscles once attached, a record of a life lived in movement or conflict. The air is dry but carries a chill that seems to come from within the earth, as if memory itself exhales. You step back, imagining the living room discussions of a migration, or the hush of a ritual in which elders sat propped against carved posts while those beneath them whispered names that cannot be translated. You imagine faces looking down from the stele, hands frozen mid-gesture, as if caught by some cultural decision to freeze form and social memory into place. Now, let's be fair about possibilities and limits. Contamination, sampling error, and interpretive bias can skew ancient DNA, isotopes, and even osteological inference. Comparative databases are incomplete, models are only as good as their inputs. Yet the convergence, bones unusually large and robust, artifacts indicating distant trade, dietary signatures inconsistent with the assumed geography, and a local poetry that remembers the extraordinary, makes it hard to consign Echo Canyon to the realm of the mundane. We still don't have a neat narrative that explains whether these were locals nourished and made large by unique diets, migrants carrying coastal practices inland, a warrior caste, or something else entirely. And if you asked me, the enduring interest here is not to prove that giants once walked the valley as a sensational headline, but to use the bones and beads as a lens to examine the kinds of connections ancient peoples forged, the social choices they made to remember and to bury, and the ways modern communities and scientists together reanimate and interpret those choices. When you leave Echo Canyon, you are less interested in the reductive certainty of labels and more attuned to the layered nature of history, a place where diet, trade, ritual, and story intermingle. The canyon teaches us about thresholds, between myth and data, between local memory and global networks, between the bodies we study and the stories we tell about them. The bones do not answer with a single voice. They offer up possibilities and invite us to imagine the human dramas that created them. We still don't know, and that lack of closure is not a failure but an opening, an argument for continued excavation done ethically, for more refined sampling, for collaboration with local communities, and for an approach that honors both the fragile biology of the bones and the living strength of the stories that made them into legend. The next place to tug at the edges of your certainty is the Silted throne, a submerged chamber beneath an old oasis, where a stone seat carved with faces that are unmistakably foreign sits half buried in compacted silt and reed impressions, as if someone took a king's chair and dropped it into time. In one breath, the silted throne of the oasis, a carved seat and a collapsed audience chamber found under meters of silt, its reliefs showing visitors with physiognomies and garments unlike those of the surrounding culture. To appreciate what we found there, first picture the landscape as it was circa 1800 to 1600 BC, a stretch when climates shifted from relatively wet to markedly drier in this region, pushing populations to concentrate around shrinking water sources. The oasis itself sits in a basin roughly 15 kilometers across. At its core was a spring-fed pool that once sustained a town whose ruins measure nearly 2 hectares before the silt reclaimed them. The throne chamber lies beneath a layer of compacted reeds and clay about 3 meters thick. When we tunneled down, the air smelled faintly of old plant oils and soot, and the ceiling of the chamber was carved into a single monolithic block, a feat of engineering that required removing or collapsing a lot of overburden without cracking the stone. Measurements tell a story. The throne seat is about 90 centimeters wide at the base, narrowing to a backrest that rises nearly 2 meters above the ground, and its armrests curl in a way that mirrors Mediterranean iconography more than local motifs. The backrest is carved with 6 faces in profile, each roughly 40 centimeters high, wearing headgear similar to circlets and long veils, and each carved with a distinct nose and jawline pattern that suggests faces from across a wide geocultural strip rather than a single homogeneous population. Nearby, fragments of painted plaster show colors still surprisingly vivid beneath the silt: cinnabar red, a deep indigo likely from imported lapis fragments, and a yellow ochre mixed with an organic binder. The floor of the throne room is a mosaic of river-smooth pebbles set into bitumen, and embedded among those pebbles were tiny shards of imported amphory, small glass beads with isotopic signatures that point to coastal furnaces, and a set of copper mirrors whose composition hints at metallurgical techniques practiced in coastal urban centers. Now, here's where it gets tricky. One interpretation is conservative and functional, that the throne belonged to a local ruler who employed foreign artisans, either as captives or as invited craftspeople, to carve a seat that would symbolize cosmopolitan status. That would explain the mixed iconography and the imported materials. Another theory posits that this was a diplomatic space, a place where representatives from distant polities met to negotiate water rights and trade corridors. The faces on the backrest could be stylized portraits of those envoys. A third, more imaginative hypothesis suggests that the throne belongs to a visiting dynasty, perhaps a transient court that established authority at the oasis for a generation before vanishing into the shifting climate. Supporters of this view point to the presence of botanical remains, grains and seeds not native to the immediate landscape but consistent with coastal agriculture, which implies provisioning by an external network. Still, for all the stonework and isotopes, we face practical problems. How did the throne, a heavy carved monolith, arrive at a site that would later fill with silt and reeds? Was it carved in place by workshops that traveled with the court, or was it moved overland from a workshop hundreds of kilometers away? Each possibility opens a different set of human behaviors: itinerant courts, diplomatic exchange, forced labor, and each of those carries consequences for how we imagine ancient social organization. There is also the physical evidence of the silt itself. The layering suggests at least 2 episodes of rapid inundation of organic debris, reeds, detritus from reed platforms, and clay, which sealed the throne in remarkably anoxic conditions. Those conditions preserved pigments and residues that would otherwise have flaked away, giving us a rare chance to read a painted surface nearly intact. Chemical analysis of residues on the armrests revealed traces of aromatic resins and oils that match incense types from coastal sanctuaries used in ritual. Were those oils used in everyday honorific ceremonies? Or were they part of a specific rite performed by visitors who treated the throne as an altar as much as a seat? Some of the mirrors were found placed as if in offering, and one mirror's reflective face still showed a faint smear of soot and tiny fragments of floral pollen trapped in a crevice. A botanical fingerprint of incense burned perhaps at the final moments before the chamber went under silt. Beyond the material, the human stories crowd the edges. An elder in a nearby village, whose family maintained water channels across generations, recited a tale of a court that came with men who spoke in a sea voice, a voice that the elder's grandmother remembered as guttural and foreign. The elder described a procession in which oxen dragged a great block of stone to the pool and men in white robes beat drums while they set the throne in place. Of course, oral tradition compresses and mythologizes. Drums and processions appear in countless memories. Yet the persistence of a motif, travelers with a sea-born manner, dovetails with the chemical and material traces we've found. Picture yourself standing at the opening of the now silted chamber, the light from your headlamp catching the painted eyes of those carved faces, and imagine the distant crash of waves that no longer exist here, whether those waves were literal or merely the memory of another world. Now, let's be fair, how many times have we mistaken stylistic resemblance for direct contact? Trade can bring materials and motifs without direct population movement. A local ruler with ambitions might hire a coastal artisan trained in Mediterranean canons, A trader might sell lapis and mirrors without moving peoples across borders. Yet the botanical signatures and the concentration of coastal artifacts in one tightly sealed context give weight to the idea that this was not a simple commodity exchange, but a more intimate, perhaps institutional connection. And what of the collapse? The siltation event seems to have been rapid, and the presence of folded textiles and scattered food residues suggests the occupants departed quickly or were overtaken by an environmental catastrophe that sealed the room. A weather event, sudden canal collapse, or even deliberate scouring to hide the chamber from invaders could have done the trick. Each scenario changes the emotion of the site. Abandonment carries sadness, hurried sealing implies fear, and deliberate entombment implies ritual finality. There are darker, more speculative ideas that have gained traction in late-night forums and some less formal publications. One of these claims that the faces carved on the throne are not merely foreign but represent a lost tribe, a maritime people who propagated up inland springs during an era of coastal collapse, bringing sea rights and foreign genes into desert centers. Some storytellers call them the wavekin, and their image in local myth is ambivalent. They brought trade and knowledge but also disease and social disruption. It's easy to lampoon such a notion, and yet ethnobotanical and osteological signals suggest newcomers who ate different foods, used different pigments, and perhaps even practiced distinct mortuary rites. If so, the silted throne becomes a physical stage on which a brief, intense performance of cultural mixing occurred, a meeting place where water and prestige were traded, negotiated, and perhaps fiercely contested. As you imagine the throne chamber lit by torches, hear the echo of sandals against stone. The painted eyes on the carved profiles regard you with a calm blankness that unsettles. You can almost see the hands that once polished the mirrors, the lips that breathed incense, the foreign words that fell like shells on the palace floor. Now consider the modern politics that shape excavation. When the team first petitioned for permits, local officials hesitated because the site sits near contested grazing lands and because the artifacts suggested foreign connections that might complicate nationalist narratives. Archaeology, it turns out, is not just about the past. It is a present-day negotiation between stakeholders with competing visions for identity and heritage. Who has rights to the story the silt has kept? Who will speak for a past that implies porous borders and shared technologies? There are technical puzzles, too, that keep scientists awake. The pigments used in the painted faces include an indigo-like compound that, in preliminary assays, shows bonding characteristics unlike common plant indigo. Some chemists have suggested it may be an inorganic blue derived from a copper-based mineral treatment. If so, it would suggest surprising technological experimentation. The mosaicked floor includes a pebble whose source is hundreds of kilometers away, and one unusual amphora shard was stamped with a maker's mark found on a coastline port thousands of years away, a small, incontrovertible link that suggests networks we have only started to map. These tiny, stubborn facts make the throne room more than a local oddity. They make it a node in a web of exchange stretching far beyond the oasis. But here's where it gets tricky again. Every extraordinary metal composition, every foreign shard, invites doubt about stratigraphy and context. Could the amphora shard have arrived later, perhaps deposited by a burrower or through later intrusive activity? Could the indigo easily be a local experiment that looks exotic under instrument lenses? Scientific caution demands repeat testing, blind controls, and the humility to revise interpretations. Still, when multiple lines of inquiry point in the same direction, unusual pigments, foreign botanical signatures, coastal metallurgy, we must at least entertain the larger historical possibility that an itinerant court, a diplomatic enclave, or a visiting dynasty once sat upon that throne, directing water and trade in a time when life itself hinged on control of springs. We still don't know whether the silted throne is evidence of a once mobile, cosmopolitan polity or a local palace that appropriated foreign style to craft its prestige. We still don't know whether the faces carved upon the backrest are portraits of actual envoys, gods reimagined by local artisans, or symbolic amalgams intended to communicate power across cultural divides. The stones keep their silence. And perhaps that is the most interesting thing. History sometimes preserves not tidy stories but invitations to keep asking richer, better questions. As you step away from the throne chamber and climb back into the light of the re-exposed oasis, feel the weight of human choices. To adopt foreign forms, to trade for distant luxuries, to leave a chair for the future that would one day be emblematic of connection and loss. Keep that sense with you. It will serve as ballast when we move on to the next mystery, because each of these places bends the lines of what we think we know about exchange, identity, and the surprising intimacy of ancient lives. We have walked a long way together across sand and stone, followed grooves carved by hands that could have been sailors, priests, or artisans, and listened to bones and pigments and oral rhyme. Now it is time to gather those loose threads beneath the sky and see what pattern, if any, they might form. When you step back from the particulars, a few stubborn themes begin to crystallize: movement where we expected stasis, an intimacy between inland and coastal worlds that our textbooks have only begun to acknowledge, and a persistence of story that turns things archaeology might call anomalies into living, negotiated memory. This does not mean we have solved everything. Far from it. But it does mean we can say with confidence that the people who lived at Desert Storm and its neighboring sites lived in a world of strange porosity, a world in which deserts could hold echoes of the sea, where giants could be both metaphor and measurement, and where a throne could be a diplomatic platform as much as a literal seat of power. Think of the stone ship, its keel cut into bedrock where no water now runs. It forced us to ask whether coastlines were different, whether ritual can mimic function so perfectly that science hesitates, and whether trade networks stretched farther and earlier than we'd imagine. Think of Echo Canyon and its upright dead, bones that ask whether stature is an index of diet, of ritual, or of lineage, and whether oral memory encodes more than mere fancy when it insists the earth once swallowed those who touched the sky. Think of the Silted throne, a painted, polished testimony to meetings that mixed faces and goods and recipes for incense that traveled with hands trained by the salt and the surf. Each of these sites, in its own way, unsettles a neat geography of ancient life in which coastal peoples stayed by the water and desert peoples tended springs. Instead, a braided, messy human world emerges, one in which goods, ideas, and perhaps people flowed along long-distance paths that could be terrestrial, maritime, or both. So what should we take from that braided picture? First, networks matter. Not just trade routes drawn on maps but social networks that move specialists, styles, and substances. A cedar plank is not merely wood, it is a node in a relationship, between a carpenter who cut it, a captain who paid for it, and a patron who placed it on a throne or a keel. The evidence we encountered, isotopes that point to marine diets far inland, microstriations that match distant metallurgy, pigments that carry non-local chemistry, forms a chorus that argues for more cosmopolitan behavior in antiquity than we often credit. That cosmopolitanism need not be equal to globalization, but it was a reality of choices made under pressure: climate change, competition for water, the rise and fall of polities, and the human desire for prestige and security. Second, ritual and practicality are entangled. The stone ship could be a boat or an emblem. The silted throne could be diplomatic furniture or a portable altar. Echo Canyon's postures might be the result of hurried burial or deliberate tableau. We live in an interpretive world that loves to separate ritual from function, but ancient people rarely operated under such sterile categories. Things could serve practical ends and symbolic ones at the same time. That duality complicates our work. Something that looks like seafaring may have been kept because it looked like seafaring, and that looking could be itself political, a deliberate statement of connection or claim. To study these places is to accept the ambiguity inherent in objects that mean more than one thing. Third, memory is a material force. Oral traditions, in languages both living and dead, do not survive by accident. They survive because they encode identity, warnings, and claims to place. The elders who spoke of black holes and giant watchers were not deluded eyewitnesses to impossible events. They were the last link in chains of remembrance that make sense of trauma, migration, and contact. Archaeology sometimes privileges texts and potsherds, but the living voice is an interpretive resource. When a poet in a village recites a stanza about men who touch the sky, and when isotope reports show disparate diets in the same graveyard, The convergence of narrative and data becomes not a curiosity but a key. Fourth, science alone will not smooth every wrinkle. Radiocarbon will refine a chronology. Isotopic assays will narrow possible diets. Ancient DNA will place ancestors on trees that tell partial stories. But each new method also multiplies questions. A radiocarbon date can move an event a century earlier or later. An aDNA match may illuminate a migration or merely the far-flung kinship of an ancient trade network. The best scientific work we can do is iterative, rigorous, and modest about its own reach. Good science in these fields is less about courtroom certainty and more about careful, public conversation, sharing data, allowing for refutation, and cooperating across borders and disciplines. Which brings me to a point we have glimpsed in small ways across these sites. Archaeology is not neutral. Funding streams, nationalist narratives, and modern stakes shape what gets dug and how it is described. The Silted throne sat in a zone where competing political actors wanted to claim antiquity for present-day legitimacy. Echo canyons, giant bones drew early sensational headlines, which in turn shaped public expectations and threatened to skew funding towards spectacle rather than slow scholarship. The ethical burden is on us, archaeologists, narrators, and viewers, to insist that the past we unearth be treated with respect, accuracy, and an eye toward the communities who inherit those stones and stories. That means collaborative fieldwork, transparent reporting, and an awareness that the stories we tell about the past can be co-opted by present-day agendas. There is also a human, emotional truth running beneath the more technical conclusions. These mysteries matter because they tether us to the continuity of wonder. When you stand at the edge of a keel carved into rock or kneel by a femur marked by the rhythms of a life, you feel a kinship with those who came before, not in a blood and bone literalism, but in a shared capacity to build, to mourn, to negotiate, and to imagine. The ocean that might have lapped at Desert Storm once is not merely lost geography. It is an index of the choices people made when climates changed and resources shifted. The giants in Echo Canyon, whether literal, exaggerated, or misinterpreted, represent the human tendency to amplify difference into all. The painted faces on the throne tell us that people looked at strangers and had to decide what to do with them: trade, fear, embrace, or fight. Those decisions are not exotic, they are ours in other clothes. As we draw the curtain on this particular series of questions, a final, practical thought: archaeology demands patience. It also demands imagination, disciplined imagination that is tethered to method. When myths suggest shapeshifters and magnetometers whisper anomalies, we must test, retest, and listen closely to both instruments and stories. There is a kind of humility required in this work, to accept that sometimes evidence will point in several directions at once, to be comfortable with provisional conclusions, and to invite the public into an ongoing conversation rather than a sealed verdict. The past, like a sand-drifted keel or a silted seat, reveals itself in stages and resists being cornered by hurried narratives. Before we part, let me bring this back to you. You have been in these scenes with me, tracing grooves, standing in canyons, peering at painted faces, listening to songs about giants. That presence matters. Public curiosity fuels funding and ethical oversight. It presses institutions to be transparent and to share data. Your willingness to hold skepticism and wonder in the same hand is precisely the posture that advances knowledge responsibly. Do not let dramatic headlines steal the nuance. Celebrate the surprise, but insist on the work that follows. Ask for sources, demand that claims be accompanied by methods, and keep your appetite for the poetic without letting it drown out evidence. In the end, why do these mysteries matter beyond the headlines? Because they enlarge our sense of human possibility. They show us a world in which people crossed unlikely boundaries, adapted to catastrophe, and found ways to make meaning. They remind us that identity is not a fixed property, it is a conversation held across generations, languages, and landscapes. They teach us to listen to the places where borders blur: deserts at the edge of seas, springs where courts met, canyons where the dead stand like witnesses. Most of all, they invite us to hold history as a living exchange, messy and open-ended, not as a museum diorama with a placard that settles everything once and for all. So keep something else with you as you leave, a sense of possibility calibrated by method. Be ready to be surprised. Be ready to revise what you think you know. Think of the people who once sat on a throne now muffled by silt, of those propped like guardians in a canyon, and of the carved keel that argues in silence for new maps of movement. These are not mere curiosities. They are invitations to reimagine how ancient humans met the world, and how we, in turn, might meet their traces with care. The sand does not hide everything forever. Sometimes it preserves. Sometimes it erases. Most often, it does a little of both, in ways that demand patience and stubborn curiosity. So go on, read the reports, follow the new isotopic studies, listen to the elders, and support the teams that work with communities to protect and study these places. Keep your skepticism, keep your imagination, and above all, keep an eye on the small, stubborn facts that refuse to fit the tidy stories. Those are the facts that push us forward. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.